Welcome to the Great Divorce Podcast, hosted by divorce financial analyst and retirement planning counselor Andrew Hatherley. Join Andrew and guest experts as they help late-life divorcees build the financial and mental foundation for a meaningful future. There is life after divorce. Now, on to the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 37 of the Great Divorce Podcast. The subject of our conversation today is prenuptial and postnuptial agreements. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the prenuptial agreement, commonly known as a prenup, but many of you may not be familiar with the postnup. Indeed, many of you familiar with the concept of prenuptial agreements may not understand them as well as you think you do, because there's a lot of misconceptions about the way they work. Our guest today is here to help us demystify the prenup and postnup. Molly Rosenblum is the owner and founding attorney of the Rosenblum Allen Law Firm. She grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, and obtained her law degree from the William S. Boyd School of Law at UNLV in 2002, where she graduated cum laude and received the Dean's Award for Academic Performance. In 2005, Molly founded the Rosenblum Allen Law Firm. Throughout her career, Molly has tried a number of family law, criminal defense, and civil cases to verdict. She is a member of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts and a certified parenting coordinator. Molly, welcome to the Great Divorce Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. So here we are, just a few weeks removed from Valentine's Day, talking about prenups and postnups. So let's start with the prenup, as I assume that these are more common, and we can get into postnups a little later in the conversation. But let's begin with the basics. Molly, what exactly is a prenuptial agreement, and why should a couple have one before getting married?
Yeah, so in its simplest form, a prenuptial agreement is essentially a contract between spouses. And within that contract, you can make arrangements for various aspects of your marriage. Some examples of that might be whether or not a spouse would get alimony in the event of a divorce. You can also specify how your assets or debts will be classified once you get married. You can accommodate for premarital assets or debts, so things that you own, like, for example, a house that maybe one spouse owns before they get married. A prenup can address how that house will be considered once the marriage happens. You can also address things like an estate plan and things like who's going to pay the household bills. So in its simplest form, basically prenup is a contract, but you can put a lot of stuff in it or very little stuff in it. Just depends on what you're looking for. And a lot of the time people want a prenup for a couple of reasons. One is for in the event that the marriage doesn't work out. I mean, that's usually the reason that we see this, is everybody wants to be on the same page or on the same playing field in the event of a divorce or a legal separation. And so that's one function of a prenuptial agreement and what it will do. But the other is just as part of general estate planning. So a lot of folks who are maybe in their second or third marriage, this isn't their first marriage, they want a prenup just to make sure that as they move forward through their divorce, everybody's on the same page.
You mentioned second and third marriages. Do you tend to see prenups more often from people who are getting married for a second and third time? Because I know I was married a second time, and for my first marriage, I did not have a prenup. And the resulting divorce, which cost me more tens of thousands of dollars than I care to divulge, and 9 months mental stability, that kind of, and of course, half of my net worth.
Sure.
That kind of put in my mind that there's no way that I'm getting married again without a prenup. So I think you tell me, but my sense is that for people who've never been married or never gone through the divorce process, or maybe haven't built up substantial assets, they're less inclined to get a prenuptial agreement than somebody who's maybe a little older and who's already gone through divorce. What do you see?
So I would tell you a lot of it kind of depends on demographic. What we're seeing is people who I would classify as older, although I think I fit in that age range as well, who maybe were married like yourself and got divorced. Generally, our older demographic, it's their second or third time around. They may not have had a prenup in prior marriages, and so they come to us with the idea that now they want a prenup. So not dissimilar to you. They've been through terrible divorce or got taken for half of their net worth or more, and they're saying, hey, we got to get a prenup this time around. But in our younger demographic, I would say folks that are maybe in their 20s or early 30s, we are seeing them quite frequently in first-time marriages. It seems like younger generation, I think prenups are a little more acceptable. There's a more practical approach, I feel like, to folks who are getting married and kind of setting those expectations for their assets and debts at the beginning of their of their marital relationship. So I think it depends on the demographic a little bit. We service all demographics, so we see it in all various forms.
That's interesting. I think with regards to social acceptability, as divorce has become more socially acceptable, I guess the prenup has become so also. And you mentioned it can be a key component of financial planning for anybody in any stage of life as well. I hear, of course, and you see this, in the media, that some people, I would never get a prenup. If somebody came to me with that, that's not romantic. That's like driving a stake through the marriage before it's even begun. I'm imagining you've probably heard that before.
Yeah, many times. We've heard people say, and I think I think I was in that category too, way back when I was younger and approaching marriage, that it's just not what we do, right? It's not, if you're in love, it'll all work itself out, and God forbid you ever get divorced, and we'll just figure it out. I think that nowadays, folks that we meet with that are younger, again, just that social acceptability and that planning. I think a lot of folks, just with the internet, with podcasts like yourself and just what's out there, and really, maybe the Kardashians have something to do with it, right? And folks watching reality TV and seeing influencers that are entering marriages with prenuptial agreements. I think just with the younger generations, it's become a lot more acceptable. I don't think they necessarily view it as romantic or unromantic, but more so like, hey, Kim Kardashian had a prenup, so I should have a prenup. Or, gosh, that divorce was really ugly and messy, and the media talked about how they should have had a prenup. So I think, as popular people are having prenups, I think it's become more widely acceptable for younger generation to have them.
Yeah, you make a good point there, Molly. It leads me to think of Tom Brady and Giselle. They were divorced, I guess, a couple of years ago, but that seemed to be over and done with really quickly. And there's probably a few reasons for that, but I'm thinking, as far as I understand, they had a prenuptial agreement.
Yeah, definitely one of the reasons to get a prenup, right, is, no one ever wants to see their marriage fail. And I think a lot of the folks that we meet with, that's not, they're not going into it with the mindset that, gosh, I need this piece of paper because I know at some point this marriage is going to be over. I think what they recognize is that the divorce process can be very lengthy. As you mentioned, it can be very expensive. It can be very emotional and very draining on, your mental health, your emotional well-being, can affect your job and your kids. And so definitely one of the reasons to have a prenup would be to shorten that time frame. So
Yeah.
everybody hopes that you get into a prenup and you never need it. We often refer to it as like buying life insurance, right? You hope you never need it, but God forbid you do, it's there and it can protect you. And hopefully, you know, it does everything that you want it to do, including if you're getting a divorce, making that process super, super short. Now, there are times where, you know, one party tries to set aside a prenup or attack a prenup, and then that does create issues. So, and that can drag a divorce out.
Well,
Even if
you
have
raised you got a few good points there. First of all, I want to go back to you mentioned insurance, because when I hear people say, well, prenups actually cause problems in relationships or even lead to divorce, my thought is, well, does buying insurance cause the house to burn down? I mean, that's really what it is, financial insurance. And one of the key benefits of prenups, yes, is if you've gone through a long, expensive divorce process, you never want to go through it again. And this is just a matter of wisdom and experience. And honestly, when you're younger, perhaps you don't think that's going to happen. But I'm encouraged that there are younger people out there that you're coming across who are taking a sensible financial planning approach to the idea of the prenuptial agreement. Now, you mentioned something a second ago about a prenup being set aside. Now, I know it's a little soon, but I just read that Kevin Costner's divorce was finalized yesterday, and I understand there was a prenup there, and I think the proceeding goes back a year or so. Now, we don't have to get into the details of that if you're not familiar with it, but I'm wondering about situations in which a prenup might be challenged or set aside or voided, whatever the terminology is. What might a couple do to ensure that that doesn't happen?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different ways that a prenup could be set aside. And I'll go back to the thing I told you at the very beginning. So prenuptial agreement is a contract, and the same ways to get out of a contract apply if you were to purchase a home or a car or enter into a business deal. Those same arguments can be made when you enter into a prenuptial agreement as a basis to undo it, right? So, for example, if you are signing your prenup at the altar as you're getting married, maybe you haven't read it or you don't really understand it, but you're signing it because somebody shoved it in your face. And 5 years later, they come forward and say there's a prenup. You might have a reason to say, hey, look, I was coerced or under duress, or I just didn't really know what I was signing. And that's clear because they handed it to me the day we got married and I didn't really have time to read it and I didn't talk to a lawyer, right? So those same defenses can come into a prenup. My understanding of the Costner divorce and why it took so long was because they were arguing over custody and child support. And so in the state of Nevada, I can tell you those types of provisions, child custody provisions and child support provisions cannot go into a prenup. And so that may be why the Costner divorce took so long, because those were things they were arguing about. So there are things in the state of Nevada that we can't put into prenups. Certain things that could void what we call void the prenup or undo it, or even make parts of it not enforceable. So there are certain things that if you put them in your prenup, for example, if one spouse says, I'm not going to work, I'm going to be the stay-at-home spouse and you're going to take care of everything, and the prenup says there's no alimony. So let's say you're in a 40-year marriage, all of a sudden that spouse is, 65, 68 years old, has no education, has no work skills, and might end up on welfare because there's no alimony in a prenup. A court's going to look at that and say, nope, sorry, under the law, we got to strike out that no alimony provision, and we got to find some alimony for the spouse that hasn't worked and has been a stay-at-home spouse for 4 years. So there are certain things that can delay it or cause, even if you have a prenup, can cause some arguments, but ways to avoid that: get a lawyer, do it early, understand what you're signing, make sure that you're not just giving in to what you think your fiance wants. If you know, for example, that your fiance is well educated and is going to be the primary breadwinner, and they say, no alimony, you really need to think about that. And what does that look like 10, 20, 30 years from now if you were to get divorced? So yeah, get a lawyer. Even though I am one, not advocating for everybody to go out and get lawyers right away, but if you're thinking about a prenup, definitely having an attorney helps to solidify it and ensure your rights. That's the biggest thing.
As you said, Molly, it's a legal contract, so you really do need an attorney. And I mean, I'm thinking here, each party needs their own independent attorney, correct? I mean, it's not typical that one attorney would draw it up.
Yeah, I mean, I will say sometimes we do have clients who, they feel comfortable with each other and comfortable with the terms that are going into a prenuptial agreement. So one spouse may agree to waive having an attorney and just saying, okay, that's fine. I can tell you, in those kind of prenuptial agreements, we have the spouse waiving a lawyer sign about 100 forms, not really that many, but feels like 100 forms, saying they understand they have the right to counsel, they're waiving that right, they understand that's not going to be a basis. But definitely, if you're spending the money to do a prenup and you're going to be bound by a prenup, having legal advice is absolutely critical to understanding what you're signing. It is a legal and binding contract. It can have, effects on your whole life for very, very long time. So it's important to understand what you're signing, what you're getting into.
You mentioned a few things that can't go into prenups. I've seen some pretty creative things going into prenups, and I want to, for instance, I'll tell you something I saw, and then maybe you could share something that you've seen. I think it was one of the housewives, one of those reality show housewives, that she would get, I think 500,000. No, I think she would get, the prenup would be voided if her husband cheated, and another one would get $500,000 extra on divorce if it was found that the husband cheated. And then I've seen other reports of prenups. I haven't actually read the prenups. I've seen other reports of prenups that one party would get $1 million for every year that they were in the marriage. So are these sort of things allowed? And have you seen this sort of thing?
I have not seen a prenup that had a cheating provision in it. Those I have not seen. Although I don't doubt that they exist, and I'm not sure how enforceable they are. But again, I would expect a court to apply contract terms. So if you agree not to cheat, or there's a financial penalty, I would expect a court, might enforce that. So that's definitely something to be cautious of. I've drafted prenups and negotiated prenups. One of the biggest things we see is marital gifts. So usually where we see that is cars. That's kind of the biggest example I can give, is where a spouse says, look, if it requires a title, right, like a house or a car, it's going to be considered separate property. However, if a spouse buys you a car and puts it in your name, then that is considered a gift, and you would keep that as your separate property. So we see it like that. I've negotiated purses and shoes and clothes. I've negotiated artwork and furniture. So where a spouse has said, one spouse is providing the furniture and the other spouse is really coming into the marriage with nothing. In the event of divorce, how their furniture would be divided, how their artwork would be divided. I have had cases where, spouses were moving into one party's home, and what would happen in the event they were to divorce, and the income earning spouse had agreed to buy a house for the non-income earning spouse in the same zip code of a certain dollar value in the event of a divorce. Needless to say, these people had hundreds of millions of dollars.
Sure.
So I think, them doing that wasn't unreasonable, and they did have children together, but they chose to get married after their children were already born. So the income earning spouse wanted to make sure that the non-income earning spouse and the kids were taken care of, which was very kind. But for most people, and those are sort of few and far between. I mean, for most people, they just want to make sure if they come into the marriage with a house or a business, that they're not going to end up giving 100% of that away to their spouse. So that's what most prenups look like.
Right. Fair enough. So we've got about 10 minutes left here, Molly. We've covered prenups pretty extensively. What is the post-nup? And I've worked on one recently, and I'd never seen one before, but it worked out very well in this particular case. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are not familiar with the concept of post-nups, although logically it's pretty easy to explain, I would think. But what's your take on the post-nup and how that works, and where that might be a good tool in financial planning?
Yeah, so in financial planning, it's never too late. I'm sure as financial planners, you tell folks that all the time, right? It's never too late to make plan for your finances, and the postnuptial agreement fits right into that. So even if you've been married for a period of time, the postnuptial agreement is just an agreement on how your assets and debts would be divided after you've gotten married. So prenuptial agreement is before marriage. And the prenuptial agreement is only effective if you get married. So when we're doing a consultation, we tell somebody, hey, you've got a prenuptial agreement and this person may pay you alimony. If you don't actually get married, you don't get the alimony, right?
Right.
The postnuptial agreement comes after the marriage has already occurred. And so same contract principles apply, and the same ability to divide up your assets and debts applies. So, where we see postnuptial agreements, couple different circumstances. One is with folks that maybe a spouse. So I've had one recently where a spouse started a business. They were married. He had the business after marriage, and he patented some technology and was in the process of selling that technology. And he accounted in that postnuptial agreement for his spouse and what she would get in the event they were to divorce. But he just wanted to make sure that if they divorced, that technology and what he was going to receive from it would stay with him. So not that they were planning for divorce, but just part of their general plan was that in the event something were to happen to their marriage, he would be able to retain all ownership interest in that technology. So kind of a different idea, but that's where we see it is usually spouses start out together, and then the light bulb comes on and says, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should have a postnuptial agreement that sort of sets all this out. Where we also see it is, spouses, marriage isn't always a straight line. It has ups and downs. And so people who aren't sure if they're going to stay in their marriage, they don't want to file a legal separation. They don't want to file for divorce, but they want something, right? Some protection of their assets and debts. And so, in the event that the marriage doesn't work out, they want to have that protection in place. And so they will consider a postnuptial agreement.
You make a good point there, Molly, about not all relationships are work in that linear fashion. You may have people, because I was thinking while you were talking, maybe the post-nup is for somebody who's already on the road to divorce, and I'm sure some post-nups may come about in that situation. But maybe after 20 or 30 years of marriage, couples can have a mature discussion about the state of the marriage, and the discussion of the post-nup may not necessarily trigger the emotions that go into getting a divorce, or may not necessarily be part of the road to divorce. I had a conversation recently with a divorce coach who was a discernment coach, and she helped people in determining, should we continue with the marriage? And it would seem to me that maybe people who are in that middle ground, this may make sense, financial sense, to have an agreement like this in place.
Yeah, and a lot of folks, I think, people who are in that middle ground, they're not sure where they are in their marriage. Definitely makes sense to make that plan. I think too, just in terms of general asset protection, life happens, right? I can tell you, not too long ago, my husband had a pretty bad car accident and he was cited for it. And so postnuptial agreements can just help with asset protection, right? In the event your spouse gets sued, and whether or not your assets are at risk. So there are a lot of different reasons to do postnuptial agreements, but I would tell you, hands down, the biggest reason we see is folks who are just in that middle ground. They're not sure. And sometimes a lot of times, I would say, I think it eases their mind, right? To know, hey, look, assets and debts are figured out. So now we just have to focus on the relationship part of our relationship and see if we can make that work.
Right. You've mentioned we've discussed a couple of the key benefits of these types of agreements. Asset protection, preventing costly fees and litigation. Also having that clarity, particularly if there might be family, members and people with doubts as to what they might end up with in the event of divorce. Having all that codified in an agreement is probably will contribute to a sense of peace of mind rather than the contrary.
Yeah, I mean, that's always our hope, right? The reason we draft these agreements is hopefully to give everybody peace of mind. Again, similar to buying insurance, you hope you never need it, but it's there in the event that it happens. And it kind of, in my mind, I think it puts everybody on the same page moving forward, right? There's no question about what's yours, what's mine, what are we splitting, how does this look if this relationship doesn't work out?
No, that's terrific, Molly. Look, thank you very much. Appreciate your sharing your thoughts. And if any of our listeners want to know more or reach out to you, how can they find you?
Sure. So easiest way is to get on our website. We are at www.rosenblum, ROSENBLUM, law, LAWLV, like Las Vegas.com. You can call us at 702-433-2889. And we're all over social media. So just search for us. We're YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram.
And LinkedIn. I've seen you on LinkedIn as well.
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Molly. Appreciate your being with us here today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Great Divorce Podcast. To learn more or get in contact with your host, you can visit Andrew's website at transcendretirement.net. Also, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. That helps others find the show, and we'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Information provided is educational only and should not be construed as legal or tax advice. Each situation is unique and should be discussed with your tax or legal advisor prior to implementation. Andrew Hatherley is not an attorney and does not provide legal advice. Information provided is financial in nature. Advisory services offered through Hatherley Capital Management, LLC. Divorce financial analysis services offered through Wiser Divorce Solutions, an affiliated company.